Welcome to My Life in Boxing with me, Gareth, and Davies, and him, Spencer, the Omen, Oliver. In this series, we interview fighters, ex-fighters, managers, promoters, and media personalities. Today on the show, sit back and relax because we've got something very special for you indeed. With us today, 7 decades in the sport, is legendary Hall of Fame boxing writer Colin Hart.
I've never seen a featherweight who punched harder than Nassim Hamid. Every fighter, whether they're 4 rounds or world champions, every time they do those 6 steps into the ring, they're risking their lives.
Would any of the boxers today, any of them, all of those out there have survived in the 60s and 70s?
I mean, Fury was clever enough to have, he wouldn't have won, he wouldn't have beaten Ali. People often ask me, who is the greatest fighter you've ever seen? Everybody expects me to say Ali. No. For me, pound for pound, the best fighter I've seen in the flesh was Sugar Ray Leonard.
Colin, you've covered everyone from Mike Tyson to Muhammad Ali to Tyson Fury today. Let's just get into it. What's your very first memory as you're just about to reach 90 of boxing?
Well, when I started at the very bottom, covering your call, Shoreditch Town Hall, Leighton Bars, West Ham Bars, Hoxton Bars, across the water, Streatham, all over London, learning about boxing, about boxers, about the trainers, the managers, going round the gyms, the Royal Oak, the famous Terry Lawless gym, the Butcher's Arms, Highgate, learning the trade, if you like. And I was given very good advice by a very famous boxing writer in London, Wally Bartleman of the Evening Standard, who said, Colin, for your first year, eyes and ears open, mouth shut.
Colin, what was your first boxing memory, you know, covering the sport? Who first grabbed your attention?
My first boxing memory, I come from the East End of London, Jewish family, steeped in boxing, it's in the DNA. My maternal grandmother was a boxing nut. She knew Ted Kid Lewis when he was a urchin, Gershon Mendelhoff, running around the streets of Whitechapel. She took me to West Ham Bars at the age of 10. I'll never forget it, in the balcony overlooking the ring. I remember a man called Jimmy Jury was in an 8-round top of the bill. I can't remember who he fought, but that was my first experience of pro boxing.
Talk to us about the landscape of Britain at the time then, when you are a young man doing this. Obviously, it's post-war. Boxing is huge at the time. People in school, they do football, they do PE, they do gymnastics, and most people box at the time.
Well, in the East End of London, where I grew up, boxing was a major, major sport. I think I'm right in saying just after World War II, there were 3,000 licensed pro boxers in Britain.
Yes.
They were supposed to be the good old days, but of course they weren't. These guys were fighting 2 or 3 times a month to put food on the table. It was certainly a working man's sport, and everybody I grew up with were boxing nuts.
I mean, how did you get involved in boxing? Did you actually box yourself?
I did at school and youth club very badly. I realised I wasn't good at it. But I came to write about boxing by sheer chance. I was a newsman on the Daily Herald. I was a crime reporter. I was night news editor of the Herald from 60 to 62. I won't give you the long, boring story why I left news and went to sport. I went to sport in 1962 as sports news editor of the defunct now defunct Daily Herald, and I started writing about boxing. The first boxing story I wrote, I was barred by Harry Levine, the London trainer. I had a contact at the Home Office, and I told him I'd left news, gone to sport. And he said, "Are you enjoying it?" I said, "Yes. Next week, we've got Sonny Liston coming over, the new world heavyweight champion." And this guy said to me, if we let him into the country, he said, with his record, prison record, he may not get in. Now, that was manna to heaven to a newsman. So I wrote a story. Sonny Liston may be barred. Harry Levine went bananas when he read the story in the Daily Herald, phoned up the sports editor and said, "Who is this guy? Never heard of him." Banned. That was my first story.
Wow.
You talk about, you covered crime, you covered news, you were the news editor at one time on the Herald, weren't you, as well? The night news editor.
Night news editor.
Night news editor, a very important role. You're putting the paper to bed,
I
as
was
we call it.
25.
Putting the paper to bed, off stone at certain times.
Oh, no, I didn't go on the stone. Not night news editor. No, but I mean, it's an important job at night when things break.
What took you then into the world of boxing? Was it family members involved in boxing, do you think? Were you around the craze at the time?
Well,
remember all those in the East End?
It was love of the sport. Because as I say, it's in the DNA. My father was a boxing fan. I said in the East End, we had, they talked about non-stop Ted Kid Lewis, Jack Kidberg, Harry Misler, all the Jewish boys who fought. They had to, there was a difference there.
They had hundreds of fights, those guys, didn't
Oh, yeah, sure.
Hundreds.
Literally. Well, Kid Lewis was had his first pro fight at 15, and so did Berg. And those were the days when they had to fight to live.
Even though you had the passion for it, like you know you love boxing, you didn't do it yourself. But what was the passion? What was the drive? What took you to that? It was interesting. With Gareth's story, was a similar sort of thing. But why boxing? Why so passionate about that?
The glamour, the excitement, the glamour, the drama. Boxing characters are larger than life, as you know, Spencer. They're the salt of the earth. And don't forget, in those days, we used to listen to the radio. The big fights were always on BBC Radio. We didn't have television then. And I remember, at 16 years of age, listening to Randy Turpin and Sugar Ray Robinson on the radio.
That's a very early 50s, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it was
51 it was.
51, yeah. And I was 16, so it would be 51.
So very soon after that, another thing that existed then and doesn't exist now, national service. You go and do national service.
Well, yeah, but I mean, that had nothing really to do with boxing, except I did 2 years in the Air Force, from 55 to 57. And if you play sport, when you're in the military, you get privileges, better food, time to train and all the rest of it. And I'll never forget, all those who want to join the boxing club, one step forward. And I went to go one step forward, and my peripheral vision, I saw a lot of bent noses. Because the amateur boxers who did their national service went in the Air Force, and the footballers who were pros went in the Army. So I did that and took one step back. I wasn't in that league.
What did you end up doing in the RAF?
I played basketball, football, and
You've kept your nose intact, that's the thing.
Absolutely.
At the time, just in that period that we're talking about, before we get into the 70s and the great golden era of the heavyweights, Arlie Frazier, Norton Holmes, Foreman, all these guys, who were the guys you were covering at the time? Were you down the York Hall a lot, Wembley Baths, as we call Wembley Arena? Who were the guys you were covering in that period?
Well, Ken Buchanan, John Conte, those were the stars of the 60s.
There's a famous heavyweight.
Well, mind you, Conti won his gold medal in 1970 at the Commonwealth Games. So round about that late 60s, early 70s, Henry Cooper, of course.
Yeah.
You know, the only British fighter to get a knighthood, thoroughly deserved. And I'm glad to say I could count him as a friend of mine.
What was considered the mecca of boxing, the hall that was most used back then? Like Haringey, yeah. A hall that they don't use anymore.
And the Empire Pool, Wembley. Bellevue in Manchester. And these were like cockpits, you know. You had to fight. The crowd were on top of you. It made fighters fight.
Nazim Hamed famously once called you Colin Hart at a press conference. Do you remember that? Does Hamed, in terms of entertainment, come in very highly? Because we were both covering his career and he was incredible as a character.
I'll be quite honest, at the time, Nazim Hamed and I did not get on. I mean, I used to get annoyed. I'm the greatest fighter ever. He was a good fighter, a very good fighter. But I used to get very annoyed with him. But I've never seen a featherweight who punched harder than Nazim Hamed or had such charisma at the lower weights. So, you know, but I mean, my boss said to me one day, he's got to be the greatest featherweight. I said, I saw four featherweights who would have beaten him. He said, would you write that? And I said, yes. And I did. Sanchez, Azuma Nelson, Salvador. And I wrote that, and of course it annoyed Hamed greatly.
I jumped ahead there. Let's go back a little bit to other fighters from that era. There's a certain heavyweight you always talk to me about, not Henry Cooper, who never fought for a world title, but became very wealthy, filled out, I think, Wembley.
Billy Walker.
Billy Walker. Now, he, for me, is very interesting. You've always pointed him out as a guy who made a lot of money, was there in the 60s with Bobby Moore and all those guys. He was in the swinging 60s, but a real star. He had that X factor, even though he didn't have world titles.
Can I just say he was the David Beckham of his day? Now, he's my mate. We go out socially even now. He's in his 80s, thankfully in very good shape. But he became famous with one punch. He was boxing for England against the USA. It may have been Britain. Live on television. And he fought a huge American called Cornelius Perry. And with one left hook, he hit Perry on the chin and laid him out cold. Live on TV.
How times have changed. Like, you're talking about amateur boxing and he become famous overnight.
Absolutely.
You know, nationally.
Absolutely.
Over that one. Yes, crazy.
Absolutely. That was his last fight as an amateur. He turned pro with Harry Levine and they did a 3-fight deal, signed live on BBC TV. It was a sensation. £7,000 for a 3-fight deal.
Wow.
Billy fought for the British, he fought for the European, got beaten both times by Henry Cooper, by a German called Karl Mildenberger, who fought Ali. He sold out the 10,500-seater Empire Pool Wembley 9 times.
What made him so popular?
He fought like it was no tomorrow.
And he got knocked down and he got up, he knocked them down. Brilliant heavyweight boxing.
The fans, what they wanted. Non-stop action, fearless. But unfortunately, Billy didn't have a great defence.
I had to bring him up because you always talk about him. Look, let's transition to this golden era of heavyweight.
Now, as a boxing writer, how lucky can you be? Muhammad Ali, I had 10 years going around the world with him.
Wow.
Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Ken Norton, then, to me, arguably the second best heavyweight to Ali, for me, Larry Holmes.
Yeah.
7 years the champion. I know Joe Louis was a great fighter, so was Dempsey. For me, they wouldn't have beaten Larry Holmes.
Let's go through the Ali time, because obviously he came to prominence at the Rome Olympics. Then he'd beaten Sonny Liston twice, won the world title. He was the Louisville Lipid. Then he became, the greatest. He converted to Islam. You were covering him from afar, presumably, because the first time you went to cover his fight live in America was in 1971.
Yeah.
So take us through the 60s with him, and then into the 70s.
I first met him, of course, when he was Cassius Clay. He was 21. He came to fight Henry Cooper in a 10-round he wasn't champion, Cassius Clay.
Yeah.
In a 10-round fight at the Wembley Stadium. Cassius Clay was hated in this country.
Incredible.
He was boastful. The British in 1963 hated loudmouth, boastful Americans. It wasn't in their nature. They were modest. We were modest by comparison. So this, if Cooper gives me any jive, he'll fall in 5. Didn't go down well for Cooper fans. And I'll never forget, the weigh-in was at the Palladium, would you believe? And the promoter was Jack Solomons. And in the dressing room, Cassius Clay saw a crown and a robe, a red robe, left over from pantomime. We didn't know. He nicked it. And he came in the ring that night with his robe and his crown on the head and was booed all the way from the dressing room into the ring. And as you know, Cooper very nearly changed the whole course of heavyweight history.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced, because nobody finished the fight better than Henry Cooper, I'm convinced in that 4th round, if the round had lasted another 20 seconds, when Ali got up after being hooked with Henry's hammer, the left hook, he wouldn't have survived.
What was your feeling on that myth that started with that glove that had been split? What was your general feeling on it then, Colin?
Well,
was it legit, or was it done because of the knockdown, obviously, the round before?
I was then not the boxing writer. I was a dog's body. I was running around getting the quotes. So I wasn't near enough to the corner. But it's been shown on TV many, many times. Henry, bless him, at times said it was 5 minutes between rounds. I've got it, I had it on video, old-fashioned video. The distance, the length of time between the 4th and the 5th rounds was 5 seconds extra. Now, as a fighter, Spencer, those 5 seconds can be vital in recovery. So, right.
Oh, absolutely.
So, right. But the glove was split in round 4. There's photographic evidence of the stuffing coming out the seam of the thumb.
Yeah.
Angelo Dundee, being the shrewd cornerman that he was, knew Clay was in trouble, and he tried to make the split wider.
Right.
He called Tommy Little, the referee, over and said, "Tommy, we need to change the glove." There was no spare gloves at ringside. If the glove had to be changed, it would have taken 15 minutes to go back to the 300 yards to the Wembley dressing room, bring it back, change the gloves. It never happened.
Obviously, as you said, you had a decade on the road with Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
You've got a taste of him here. The first time you go to the United States, I remember you've always told me this, and it's extraordinary. The first fight you covered in the US as the boxing writer was which?
The fight of the century. It's embedded on my brain. March the 8th, 1971.
Wow.
Madison Square Garden. The only time then that two unbeaten heavyweights fought for the world title. As you know,
Yeah.
It's happened since.
he'd come back after 3 years in exile.
Yeah.
He'd beaten Quarry and Bonavina and then went in straight away into Frazier, which in hindsight was a mistake, too quick. Anyway, on the night, the atmosphere in the arena, 20,000 people, was so intense. People don't realise this. 2 men died having suffered heart attacks with the excitement.
What was it like being in America at the time, travelling around America?
Well-
because you've got the rise of another little generation coming just after them as well. Just talk to us about what America was like, what it was like covering boxing then.
Boxing writers in New York were kings. I remember John Condon, the press chief at the Garden, when I was going over for the Buchanan-Ismail Laguna fight, said to me, "What flight you on?" And I told him. He said, "Well, have you met?" I got off the plane and there was a guy there with a placard. He took me through security. Well, it wasn't security then. He took me through immigration
Really?
into a limo to take me into Manhattan. A London boxing writer. That's the way we were treated. Boxing was so big. It was before Vegas. It was, the Mecca was the Garden.
How different was it covering boxing in America to what it was in the UK? Because as you said, you know, in the UK it was a massive sport back then, but America took it to another level.
did you
Explain
get-
how different that was.
And did you get massive access to them all? Were you around them all the time?
It was amazing. Non-stop access. And the fighters were at our disposal. When do you want to see them? We'll get them there. Now, can you imagine that today with Fury, with Joshua, when the fighters are told the press want you there now? Can you
Did you
imagine?
get hours with them in hotel suites?
There was no
hotel lobby.
There was none of this. You've got 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the relationships must have developed as well.
Yes.
Then.
You became, I'm not saying bosom pals, but they know you. They knew you. They knew who you were, what you were after. And they, Leonard, Hagler, Hearns, Duran, it was part of the boxing family.
We had stars over this side of the water and over in the US. Tell me about your relationships. How different was it with the US fighters and the UK fighters? Who were most easy approachable? Who did you connect with more?
Well, the thing you find, and I think Gareth will agree, you can write 500 stories
Yes.
in praise of a fighter.
Yeah.
Then you criticise once.
Yeah.
It's the only story they ever remember you've written then, isn't it?
All the other 500 they've forgotten about. You've criticised me. Now, I like to think that when I criticise a fighter, it is a valid criticism. I'm not taking a cheap shot, although I won't go into it, but on a lesser level, I did once take a cheap shot at a fighter and I was ashamed of it afterwards. But, most of the time, my relationship with fighters on both sides of the Atlantic were excellent.
Yeah.
I like to think it's because, I may be boasting here, that I knew what it was all about.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's that. Of that whole era, and I almost want to force you to tell us it's this one, you're the only living British journalist who was at the Rumble in the Jungle. Probably the most watched fight of all time between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. Is that one of your favourite, most memorable experiences?
Well, it was one of the most bizarre experience. You did mention I did athletics, which meant I covered 8 Commonwealth Games, 8 European Championships, 8 World Championships, and goodness knows how many world titles.
Not to mention the Olympics.
I said 8 Olympics. Right. But that is without doubt the most bizarre event I've ever covered. As you know, promoted with the help of one of the most odious butchers Africa has ever had, President Mobutu of Zaire, who put up the money for that fight to take place, $10 million.
Did you feel safe going over there then, by the way?
Sorry?
Did you feel safe? Did it feel safe over there when you were covering it?
Absolutely.
Explain a little bit about that.
The last thing that Mobutu wanted was for anything to happen to the foreign media.
Right.
Right? But, I mean, what was interesting, the fight, as you know, was postponed for 6 weeks because Foreman got cut in training. Foreman and Ali hated Zaire. They hated being there. And Mobutu put them under house arrest, virtually, to make sure in the 6 weeks they didn't leave the country.
Wow.
Because he was concerned they wouldn't come back.
Wow.
Ali probably would not have gone back. I was in the hotel called the Memlin with the British media. Foreman and his entourage was in the Intercontinental. And Ali was out at Inseli, the Chinese
built compound by the sea, by the
river.
By the river, exactly.
By the River Zaire.
Yes.
But just give you one story. We couldn't get telephone calls back to London, so we had to send our copy by telex. The telex operators very often were asleep when they should have been working, and the foreign press en masse complained to Shimpumpu Wa Shimpumpu, the press chief.
What a memory.
That's
right?
Incredible.
Anyway, who wore a fedora hat 24/7. So we complained. And an edict came from the man himself, Mobutu, which said, the next telex operator who's found asleep when he should be on duty will be shot.
Wow.
He wasn't kidding. And there they all were, beaving away. But very often they sent the stories to the wrong addresses. The late Neil Allen of the Times, who was a great boxing writer, found that his preview of the fight ended up in the Cambridgeshire Woodyard. Don't forget, the fight was announced in Caracas, Venezuela, by Don King, who I'd never met before, who said, Ali's going to fight Foreman. This was the night before he fought Norton, defended the title against Norton. He knocked Norton out in 2 rounds. Everybody knew that was going to happen. It will take place in Kinshasa, Zaire, at 4 a.m. in the morning. Well, I'm not exaggerating. I nearly fell off my chair laughing. Who is this clown? Anyway, 6 months later, there we were, 4 o'clock in the morning, at ringside in Kinshasa, covering this fight. I tipped Ali to win because I had been told about Foreman's lack of stamina. And I thought, who's ever knocked Ali out? I saw Frazier in the 15th round in New York hit Ali with a left hook that would have stunned an ox. Ali hit the deck, rolled over and stood up. And I thought, if Frazier could knock him out, I can't see Foreman knocking him out because he's such a clever boxer. And I was in 2 minds. I thought, I'm going to make a fool of myself if I tip Ali to win. I was having a drink with Bob Walters, a very well-known and respected American boxing fighter. And I said, Bob, you're probably going to think I'm mad, but I'm going to pick Ali. I'm thinking of picking Ali to win. He said, I don't think you're mad. I'm going to pick him to win. I said, why? He said, I was ringside, I think it was in California, when Foreman was fighting an Argentine light heavyweight, whose name has gone out my head. And at the end of the 9th round, he was exhausted and didn't want to go out for the 10th. They forced him out. He was winning the fight by a mile. And I thought, in the heat of Zaire, with Ali's mind games and his chin and his bravery, I'm going to tip him to win. And I tipped him to knock out Foreman in round 9. As you know, he finished him in round 8. I was waiting for the hero grab.
From your editor?
From my sports editor, Frank Nicklin. I thought, I'm the only British writer who picked him to win. I got the cable from Frank. It said very simply, why wrong round?
Let's move on, because it's an incredible period you next cover. I mean, we could have spoken all day about that heavyweight era. The era of the Four Kings, Leonard, Duran, Hagler and Hearns, they fight each other 9 times in all, and you attend 7 of those fights.
I covered 7 of the 9.
Of the 9. Talk to us about, perhaps, I think my experience of you is you're probably closest to Sugar Ray Leonard.
People often ask me, who is the greatest fighter you've ever seen? Everybody expects me to say Ali. No. For me, pound for pound, the best fighter I've seen in the flesh was Sugar Ray Leonard. To me, he had everything. Speed, skill, punch power, bravery, technique. He was to me not the
looks,
perfect.
charisma, everything.
Yeah,
everything.
not good looks.
Olympic gold.
Yeah.
All of the, everything.
To me, it was everything. And personality.
Yeah, incredible.
Personality plus. But he lost to Duran in Montreal. And I was there. And I've always said, when people say, what's the greatest fight you've ever seen? Without hesitation, the first Leonard Duran fight had everything that you want to see in boxing. Hagler was a sweetheart.
There you go.
I mean, I wouldn't have, I mean, what he did in the ring was frightening. But outside the ring, he was a lovely, lovely guy.
Yeah, I did.
And what endeared me to him, he told me a story. He came from Newark, New Jersey. He was involved as a child in the race riots, and his mother took him and his siblings out of Newark into Massachusetts for safety. And he had 5 kids. And he was telling me about one of his daughters who was getting very lippy. As being the father of daughters and granddaughters, I know when they get to that early teens, they can be trouble. And she wasn't appreciative of the way they were living. And Marvin said, I put her in the car and I took her back to Newark, where I came from, and lying in the street with the drunks and the druggies. And I said, this is where I came from. Maybe you'll appreciate what you now have. And that was Hagler.
We've got to move on to the next period that you've covered in your career, Colin, and it's the Mike Tyson era, let me call it that. Talk to us about how big you've covered this golden age, you've covered the Four Kings, and suddenly this new kid's on the block, Mike Tyson.
No, I knew about this new kid on the block a long time before a lot of other people, because Mickey Duff, arguably the greatest matchmaker who ever lived. He was making his early fights, and he told me about this kid, this teenager in New York, who was knocking people out one after the other. And I was on my way to Vegas, and I said to my then boss, this kid Mike Tyson, who they reckon is going to be the youngest heavyweight of all time to win the world title, he's fighting at the Garden. Please let me stop off and interview him on my way to Vegas. No problem. So through Mickey, I got Jim Jacobs to allow me to speak to Tyson after his fight on the undercard, the semi-final. He knocked out Reggie Gross in 1 round. And there I am talking to the teenage Tyson. And he was telling me about how he beat up the kid in Bed-Stuyvesant who wrung the neck of his favourite pigeon. And while he was telling me, I could see in his eyes he was reliving the experience.
Could you tell then, Colin, that this guy was going to be a superstar? Like, he was a superstar outside of boxing. He was a global superstar, wasn't he?
I had no idea that he was going to be so notorious.
Yeah.
But from a boxing point of view, I said, I'm told he is likely to be the youngest ever heavyweight champion, and I think we ought to go and see him. That was him.
But that era, Mike Tyson, Holyfield, Riddick Bowe, Lennox Lewis, to name just but 4 of a series of probably the principal 4 in that era. How did you compare that then when you're covering that compared to your era with the Golden Age?
Yeah, you've asked me a question that I'm always asked. How would Bowe, Holyfield, Tyson get on against Holmes, Ali,
Frazier, Norton?
Right. Now, I think Ali would have beaten all of them, all 3 of them.
Really?
I think Frazier would have had too much bottle for Tyson and would have beaten him. I think Holmes would have beaten all 3 of them. But you've got to realise, I grew up, that was my era. You talk to the late Frank Butler, who covered Joe Louis before World War II. To Frank Butler, Louis would have knocked Ali dead. Speak to Nat Fleischer, as I did, when Nat was an old man, the founder of Ring magazine. Who was the best heavyweight? Nat, not Tyson, not Ali, not Joe Louis.
Not Jack Johnson.
Jack Johnson.
Jack Johnson. Goes all the way back.
He covered Jack Johnson.
Wow.
And as far as Nat was concerned, before World War I, and as far as Nat was concerned,
why are we influenced in that way? Because we've been around them? Because we
yes,
a love of them?
Because you grow up with them. They're the ones you grow up with.
In the last 20 years, when we've become adults and we're covering them through our milieu, if you like, Carl Froch, David Haye, Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, this era.
Joe Calzaghe.
Joe Calzaghe as well. How do you see...
I've already mentioned you.
Yeah.
How do you see boxing now? How do you see this era? What are the things you're learning that are different maybe that we're in our kind of maturity covering, but you're in your dotage looking at?
Well, years ago, I mean, when you think of the number of fights they had years ago compared to now, where you've got the world heavyweight champion maybe fighting twice a year. It's completely different. It's a TV sport. Now, pay-per-view has taken over the big fights. Now we've got the Saudi interest, the Riyadh.
Social media as well is a huge influence.
Yeah. But I'm afraid when I go to major fights now at, say, the A2, 20,000 people. And I look round. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm wrong. Probably am wrong. But I look at them. They're there with their girlfriends, having a great time. I feel they go there to sing rather than watch boxing.
Yeah.
What, sing Sweet Caroline, experience the atmosphere.
They look forward to Sweet Caroline. You go into the arena, the undercard is going on. It's empty.
It's now an event, isn't it? That's
They
the difference.
go
It's like your
to
hardcore
an
boxing
event.
fan.
And most of them, I believe, don't know a left hook from a coat hook. They go because they want to be seen at an event.
Let me ask you, you've talked about lots of other people and we've got some of your experiences. What are the things that you take away that boxing's taught you about life?
There are degrees of bravery, as you know. And Spencer, he survived, thankfully, a very nasty period in his life when he could have died. Every fighter, whether they're 4 rounds or world champions, every time they do those 6 steps into the ring, they're risking their lives. They're not sure whether they will walk down again under their own volition. So, the bravery is the most dangerous sport on earth. It can never be made 100% safe. Thankfully, over the years, it has become as safe as it possibly can be. I remember interviewing Bruce Woodcock, former British heavyweight champion of the late 1940s, early 50s, who told me he boxed 9 times with one eye.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Would any of the boxers today, any of them, all of those out there have survived in the 60s and 70s?
Fury was clever enough to have, he wouldn't have won, he wouldn't have beaten Ali. And I don't think he would have beaten Holmes.
What about Usyk? What about Terence Crawford? What about Canelo?
Usyk, he's not a heavyweight. He's become a heavyweight. Brilliant technician.
It's the size of Muhammad Ali, though,
Yeah,
isn't
but
he?
yeah, compare him to the heavyweights of that era. When you're talking about your Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, they were smaller back then, though, Colin, in their prime, wasn't they?
He's the
Like,
same
they weren't
dimension
Usyk
as
sort of
Ali.
They were extremely powerful.
You still have an undying passion for it. You can be.
Yeah.
So how has the sport evolved to where we are today? How has it evolved?
Well, it's got safer. It's got no doubt about it.
Because we didn't know before.
Well,
we
we-
just didn't know.
No.
Medical
we did.
science has improved so much.
And medical science, sports science, it's all improved.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately, there are still fighters who go on far too long. And if only they could be stopped. They can't because of legalities. You can't take a man's livelihood away unless he's physically unfit.
Sure.
Should there be an upper limit then?
No,
because they can't.
because-
It's too arbitrary, isn't it?
Yes, because some people can be as brilliant at 40 as they are at 35.
Colin, what's your feeling on Turki Al-Sheikh and Riyadh season, their influence on boxing now, how now they've taken the politics away, against different networks and 40-50 splits, etc., etc., etc. Do you think now the best fighting the best and getting these best fights made of this modern era has been a good thing for boxing?
One of the problems, there used to be 8 champions. And everybody said, I wish we had 8 champions in 8 divisions today. We've got 67 world champions over all these divisions.
He's talking about bringing that back again.
But those days were not good days for fighters.
Right,
Oh,
okay.
interesting.
Some excellent fighters never got a look in. It's good to have 2 world champions, not 4 in each division.
And Riyadh season and Turki
Now,
Al-Sheikh's
Riyadh
involvement?
season, obviously, to see, look, a better BF and B4. The return is coming up. The first fight was an absolute joy to watch.
To have the undisputed heavyweight title, to have big cards, to have we can dream about fights and they're happening now.
Well, they're happening. We used to dream about fights and the dream would disappear. We've got to look forward to, from what I gather, in the early September, Canelo against Crawford.
Yeah, can't wait for that.
That's a Hagler-Leonard super fight.
Absolutely.
It's exact. Well, it's not exactly.
BF.
That's what it is.
Yeah, it's Ali Fraser.
So, final few questions for you, Colin, as we finish off today, and they are specifically to you. What's the moment you're most proud of in your career in boxing writing?
Picking Ali to be foreman.
What's the single biggest memory you've got over all those years?
John Conte, world light heavyweight champion, in my house, trying to get my 3-week-old young daughter, Lara, to sleep.
Wow.
What's your wisdom? Because they say never get too close to fighters, don't they?
They do indeed, because no, what they say, never fall in love with a fighter. Right. Also, having a friend like Eddie Fudge, the black American trainer, who I can proudly say came to my house for dinner when he brought Hedgeman Lewis to fight John H. Tracy, came to my house for dinner and read my 2 daughters their bedtime story. A man who trained 5 world heavyweight champions.
One of the greatest of all time, for sure. Colin, final question to you, my friend. Any regrets?
No regrets whatsoever. Given the chance, I'll do it all over again.
And what would an 89-year-old Colin Hart tell that 10-year-old in East London? What advice would he give him today about his life that was ahead of him?
You don't realise how lucky you're going to be.
Well, it's brilliant. We've been very lucky to spend this time with you today, Colin. What an amazing life you've had in boxing. Your life in boxing, Colin Hart.
I appreciate it.
What an amazing life in boxing Colin Hart has had. Well, you've been watching My Life in Boxing with me, Gareth Davies, and him, Spencer the Omen Oliver. We will see you next time.